everyone. My name's Chante Harris, and I essentially work as a go-to-market strategist, helping companies scale in complex urban environments like New York City. I ended up at Capalino after participating in a fellowship program. I realized that, I was working in policy, doing a lot of the political wonky stuff you do in DC, and decided that I wanted to switch things up. And so during this program, I essentially worked across different sectors. I worked for government, the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. I worked for one of the largest not-for-profits, doing a lot of work around the undocumented community and DACA at that time. I also worked for an affordable housing real estate developer based out of Brooklyn and helping them think through things like AMI and also community outreach around some really large real estate development projects. I worked for another think tank that was really focused on economic prosperity and how do we think about policies that allow everyone to participate in our economy in an equal way. And then I completed the program and pretty much, asked myself, what can I do that, is different than maybe what I was doing before, but still, has some applied skill sets, and ended up at Capalino, really at the intersection of business and government, recognizing that it's a really important place to be because I can not only speak to the regulators and the policymakers that are thinking about how do they respond to industries, but also the founders, the innovators, the companies that are thinking about how do we drive innovation in a place like New York. And cannabis, just kind of neatly fell into that as we were talking about what it means for New York in the future. And so a couple folks on my team and I decided to get involved. And so I've been doing some work in that space now for a little over 2 years. I think the most exciting thing about New York is really the market opportunity here, right? I mean, whether you're looking at tourism or just, the sheer density of customers that exist in this market. I believe it was 2018 when Scott Stringer actually released his report looking at how big the market would be for the city in its first year, and it was estimated at $3 billion. I think when we look on the business side of things, what the opportunity is here, it's huge, and that's not even thinking about New York State as a whole. I also think New York is really positioned to be a state where you can think about the vertical in a meaningful way. The reality is that we need jobs both in the city and then also the rest of New York. There's a unique opportunity to really think about an economic driver, particularly when we need it the most during COVID. I think starting there has kind of been my focus, right, as someone who essentially advises companies on how to scale in this market. My policy and advocacy background, though, brings that additional layer of, hey, what does it look like for New York to really learn from other markets and be able to kind of be an exemplary case study as it relates to thinking about all of the meaningful ways and touch points that people have into entering this industry. And it's not necessarily, being a large vertically integrated company, but it could be being a part of the vertical or being a part of the ancillary business piece or doing research and really understanding this plant in ways that we haven't really been able to explore in the past. New York is so great in that it has so many institutions and existing entities that are already adjacent. So doing these things across other industries, I think they're well positioned to then back into or just be a part of the industry moving forward. In terms of the company overall, we've definitely seen certain sectors hit really hard, right? If we're talking about real estate, during the beginning of quarantine, the governor essentially stopped all construction, right? And so when you think about New York being this huge real estate city, it's having a huge impact on how we think about the future of housing. And that being said, I do think there's unique opportunities to think about real estate differently. How do they kind of reuse spaces that perhaps they anticipate for a different use, but might be a great place for either testing sites or whatever it is, an innovative idea that allows us to rethink place and how we actually interact in cities. In terms of cannabis specifically, I mean, yes, 100%. The minute that COVID hit, while that wasn't the initial conversation, what we saw was a deep desire to really bring cannabis into the discussion about how do we rebuild this city, how do we rebuild this state in light of increased urbanization across the country and the globe. While I think, yes, COVID is going to have an impact on the amount of density in terms of, the short term, I think in the long term, we all know that people are attracted to cities. They want to work in cities. They want to live in cities. And while COVID has had a huge impact, and I'm sure will continue to have an impact on how people view living in a city, I do think that cities are still a place that people see as economic drivers, as opportunity, as places with rich diversity. And so let's plan for the longer term, right? Let's plan for what it looks like to actually rebuild. And I think that there are legislators and government stakeholders who really understand that. And particularly when COVID hit, you saw folks like Majority Leader Krista Peoples-Stokes and a lot of the folks who have already, Senator Kruger, who have already been championing this, saying, hey, this is not the only reason why we need to pass legalization, but this is even more of an impetus to make us understand that this is the time, right, where we're dealing with huge public health implications. And we could talk about medical cannabis and what that means and how that's actually a part of research right now in light of COVID as potentially being a real remedy, right, for this virus. But outside of that, it's also equity, where we're having to have a lot of discussions around what justice means. And I think cities are more prone to having to deal with some of the inequality that exists in this country because of the amount of diversity and the rich cultures that exist. There are companies that were already thinking meaningfully about the social equity piece. And I know that's really hard for people to hear or maybe grapple with because the larger narrative is, and it's true, right, that a lot of these companies, whether you're looking at cannabis or other industries, have not thought meaningfully about inclusion, have not thought meaningfully about equity. From my experience, having been, working with companies for the past 2 years, that's always been at the center, to be honest, of how we've thought about growth strategy, and not just from the perspective. And I think George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement has only exacerbated this kind of common thread of understanding that it's not just CSR, it's not just social impact, it's also how do you attract all of your potential customers? How do you actually scale so that you're reaching the entire market? And so if you look at existing companies, I won't pinpoint anyone in particular, but when you don't have a real understanding of community, when you're not thinking about these things as part of your growth strategy, you actually miss out on revenue, right? So it's the argument for impact. And I know that depending on who I'm talking to, that's enough. But I know that for some actors, that's not enough, right? And so it's not just impact, it's also revenue. And I have this conversation not only with cannabis companies, but with, pretty much every company I speak to. But I think in light of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, what I really see is whether companies have necessarily come out more and said, hey, we're going to do X, Y, Z. I can't say I've honestly seen that. I will say, though, I've seen an increase in accountability or the ask of accountability, whether that be internally at companies, so people who understand the value of that working internally at these companies, or, the advocates that have either already been a part of the industry or even advocates outside of the cannabis industry that see its intersection with criminal justice, with policing, and saying, hey, we're simultaneously trying to essentially stop this war on drugs that has disproportionately impacted communities of color, while we're also creating an infrastructure of $1 billion industry. And we can't silo those two things, right? They're interconnected. And so how do we talk about business and how do we talk about policy and advocacy and entrepreneurship all, together? We are focused primarily on New York, but I think the thing about cannabis is because it's this emerging industry, a lot of what we've done to really put us in a position to be able to adequately advise companies and also advise policymakers has been learning from other markets. So that was my biggest priority, my team's biggest priority when we said, hey, it's 2018. Cynthia Nixon's talking about marijuana legalization. New Jersey is talking about legalizing. Massachusetts is legalized. Just thinking about surrounding markets and what it means to place pressure, we said, hey, this is a unique opportunity to really think about what does a sustainable cannabis industry look like for New York. And we started really doing our due diligence, understanding who the actors were, already knowing the policymakers, but then wanted to expand our knowledge to the other communities that existed. So the advocate, and then you have the entrepreneurial community, and then you have the really large operators that exist in other markets. And so what we did was talk to all of these people and really get an understanding of how they were thinking about the industry. And what we quickly realized was that a lot of these conversations were siloed. So you had the business conversation happening with existing operators and learnings from being in this industry for several years, not being new to it in the same way that other folks are. And then you have the policymakers really thinking about how do you set up a framework for a new industry in a place like New York. And then you have the advocates, right? And so the people who are talking about equity be talking about it in a meaningful way, because I think you and I both know that equity is really a buzzword, particularly for this industry. But all that to say that we saw that these conversations were happening in silos. And so we said, what would it look like, which is, sort of our expertise, to bring together all of the necessary stakeholders to have a conversation. For me, it was, let's not wait again until we have another maybe 10 ROs or companies in this market to talk about what we could have done to really set business up in a way where, not only they're successful, impactful, diverse, look different than maybe our current infrastructure, but also they have an understanding of what guidelines or frameworks they should be thinking about in relation to community impact. We hosted our first cannabis summit, which brought out over 200 actors. And, not to toot my own horn, but I think that it was really one of the first really sophisticated discussions or long day, half day summit discussions about the industry across all different categories. And so we had a conversation about what can New York learn from other markets. I think sometimes states and policymakers will say, hey, they did it this way. That's how they've done it. They did it before. So we're going to kind of just replicate that, but not talking to the businesses that were actually on the other side of that, right? That actually were part of those programs, that were part of those application processes. And then we also had a conversation about equity and also inclusion in the business. And so what does it look like to actually have diverse actors be a part of the business side and not just be the advocates? Myself and a lot of people I know are going to continue to advocate for it. So my hopes are 2021. I don't want to see this drag on for years and years. And I actually think there's a unique opportunity to position New York in a different way, right? If we're talking about federal legalization and what that could mean, right? Then it becomes, you're having to adhere to national standards versus maybe being able to create your own. New York does want to see diversity, does want to see, overall impact throughout the state. And so I think that it's a unique opportunity now to actually start to create a framework that federal government can learn from, but also the New York can actually own moving forward versus just having to meet restrictions that may or may not be the best for a market like New York. But there are so many smart people, this in this industry working. And so I'm confident that we could create something unique and create something impactful.